Hello everyone and welcome again to our class. This is the third lesson in music for the third quarter, and what we are going to discuss today is about the connections between romantic music and art. For our learning competency and objectives, at the end of the lesson you'll be able to relate romantic music to other art forms and its history within the era. And for our objectives, first, let's discuss the historical background of Romanticism. Second, relate the music of Romantic period with other art forms. And third, identify the different characteristics of Romantic period music and art. So let's get started. Oh, by the way, before we start our discussion, I would like to remind everybody to take down notes dahil yung activity natin mamaya ay manggagaling dito sa mga lecture na pag-uusapan natin sa araw na ito. So, we are going to watch a video presentation again, and I hope that you will note down all the important points because you will need that later in our activity. Okay? So for us to fully understand the connections between romantic music and art, we're going to watch a short clip from study.com, and it will discuss the romantic movement and romantic trends, and from there we will be able to analyze the connections between romantic music and arts. So let's get started.
Romanticism was a Western cultural movement that began in the early 1800s as a reaction to the neoclassical love of reason and order that dominated the previous century. Romanticists were imaginative individuals who championed creativity and artistic freedom. The movement affected all forms of art, literature, and music in Europe, eventually spreading to the United States and other parts of the Western world. Within Romanticism, several key trends emerged. Let's explore some of the more common trends we'll see when looking at romantic art and listening to romantic music. Emotional subjectivity. Capturing extreme emotional states was a hallmark of this era. French artist Theodore Géricault's painting The Raft of the Medusa depicts a scene of intense suffering and desperation. This iconic work of French Romanticism shows an impending storm at sea that threatens the helpless and starving survivors of a shipwreck. Romantic painters, like Géricault, used bold colors and preferred to paint subjects in motion rather than static portraits or perfectly balanced scenes. Romantic musicians liked using bold tone colors, a term that describes the unique sound of a musical instrument. To expand the tone color options available, several new instruments were added to the orchestra during this era, including a large amount of percussion instruments like the triangle, as well as the tuba, concert harp, and celesta, a piano-like instrument that has a sound similar to that of a music box. With this rich orchestral palette, composers were able to create intensely emotional music. One composer who took advantage of the expanded orchestra to create highly emotional melodies was Peter Tchaikovsky. His musical representation of the story of Romeo and Juliet perfectly captures both the passion of the young lovers and the fiery intensity of the sword fights between the dueling families. Romantics often created art based on contemporary events, especially those related to politics. One example is Ludwig van Beethoven's Third Symphony. Originally composed as a tribute to Napoleon Bonaparte, a man whom Beethoven admired for his democratic ideals, Beethoven later ripped up his dedication page in anger after Napoleon declared himself emperor. Beethoven renamed his piece Heroic Symphony, composed to celebrate the memory of a great man. Most commonly known by its nickname, the Eroica, this symphony is one of the early masterpieces of musical romanticism. The use of a descriptive title, rather than a generic one, is a particular hallmark of Romantic-era music, aimed towards inspiring the imagination. Like Géricault's painting, the music of this symphony involves intense expressions of emotion, changing from lighthearted cheerfulness to pained anguish in seconds. The Raft of the Medusa was based on a contemporary event as well, the highly controversial 1816 shipwreck of a French naval vessel. The captain and chief naval officers saved themselves, abandoning 147 passengers on a hastily made raft. Only 15 survived. The reason Beethoven was so upset about Napoleon's self-coronation was because he, along with many others, had believed that Napoleon was a champion of the common man. Democratic sentiments were sweeping the continent, and nationalism became an important factor in encouraging revolutionary activity. At the time, many Europeans were seeking independence from the monarchical rule that had dominated Europe for centuries, especially that of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. As citizens rebelled, contemporary painters helped promote nationalist agendas through their art by glorifying this revolutionary activity. A famous example of this is seen in Eugène Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. This painting depicts the allegorical figure of liberty at the head of a motley crowd of French revolutionaries from all social classes. The painting is based on the July Revolution of 1830, a rebellion that dethroned King Charles X. Some Romantic-era composers, like Friedrich Chopin from Poland, wrote music that promoted nationalism by incorporating folk music. Many of Chopin's piano pieces are written in the style of Polish folk tunes and dances, like the mazurka. Other composers, like Clara Wieck Schumann, wrote music with allegorically political lyrics, like her song Forward. The title was the slogan for the German democratic movement, and the song became a rallying anthem for revolutionary activists during the political demonstrations of 1848 and 1849. Attempting to capture the power and beauty of nature was a tempting challenge for artists and musicians alike. Czech composer Bedřich Smetana combined the themes of nationalism and nature in his work Die Moldau, an orchestral piece that takes the listener on a musical journey along the river Vltava. It starts at the river's origin, with two small mountain streams in the Czech countryside that combine to flow through the Bohemian forests and finally into the mighty river that surrounds the great city of Prague. Smetana recreates the flowing sounds of the river with a lush and rolling melody played by the string section of the orchestra, while the brass depict the ancient Czech fortresses and castles along the riverbank. Painters like John Constable recreated sweeping landscapes, like Salisbury Cathedral from the Meadows, painted in 1831. Arching over this idyllic scene is the rainbow surrounding the cathedral, which lends a fantasy-like quality to the scene. This brings us to the next trend: realms of fantasy. An exploration of all things fantastic, including the idyllic, the irrational, the world of dreams, and the surreal, was encouraged during the Romantic era. Sometimes the imagery was light-hearted, like Constable's Cathedral or Felix Mendelssohn's musical depiction of mischievous fairies in his Overture to A Midsummer Night's Dream. Sometimes the realms of fantasy took a much darker turn. Francisco de Goya's painting Witches' Sabbath depicts a coven of witches holding a Black Sabbath ritual, the same subject composer Hector Berlioz chose for the fifth movement of his fantastic symphony, titled Dreams of a Witch's Sabbath. With the imaginative realms of fantasy came a fascination with the exotic. As intercontinental travel conditions improved, painters and musicians tried to capture the sights and sounds of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Many Romantic-era composers experimented with adding exotic sounds to their compositions by avoiding traditional Western scales, creating unusual harmonies, and using innovative compositional practices. A famous example of exoticism is Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov's symphonic poem based on the story Arabian Nights. The most famous movement from this piece is Scheherazade, a musical depiction of the legendary harem storyteller who kept herself alive through her ability to charm a cruel emperor with her enthralling tales. Scheherazade was also a popular subject for Romantic painters, including Sophie Anderson. Romanticism was an artistic movement that affected the visual and musical arts during the 19th century. There were several key trends that helped to define the Romantic era. Emotional subjectivity involved representing people in extreme emotional states. In music, this often involved using a full orchestra for power and a variety of instrumental tone colors, as is heard in Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet Fantasy Overture. Painters used bold colors to capture subjects in motion, as in the Raft of the Medusa. Romantics were often involved in political movements like nationalism, using their music and art to promote revolutionary activity. For example, Delacroix's painting Liberty Leading the People was a response to a revolutionary uprising that toppled King Charles X of France, while Beethoven's Third Symphony was composed as a tribute to Napoleon Bonaparte. Nationalism was also reflected in composers' use of folk music in compositions and their creation of rallying political anthems. Romantics often turned to nature and realms of fantasy for inspiration. Smetana used a flowing string melody to recreate the sound of the Vltava River, while Mendelssohn used the same instruments to represent mischievous fairies flying through the forest. Sometimes, the fantastic took a darker turn, like Francisco de Goya's painting of witches at a Black Sabbath, which was the same subject composer Berlioz chose for the fifth movement of his fantastic symphony. Finally, Romantics were often fascinated with the exotic and brought the sights and sounds of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East to Europe through their music and art.
So there you go. I hope that you got something from that video presentation while you are taking down notes. So in summary, Romanticism was a 19th century European movement that affected virtually all phases of the creative and performing arts. So we have learned the connections between romantic music and visual arts in this lesson, and it is stated there that Romanticism was a Western cultural movement that began in the early 1800s as a reaction to the neoclassical love for reason and order that dominated the previous century. So romanticists were imaginative individuals who championed creativity and artistic freedom, and the movement affected all forms of art, literature, and music in Europe, eventually spreading to the United States and other parts of the Western world. So there are different romantic trends that were discussed in the video presentation. The first is what we call emotional subjectivity, okay? So, capturing extreme emotional states was a hallmark during this era. Kaya nga yung mga paintings na nila Delacroix, like the Raft of the Medusa, yung mga composition nila Peter Tchaikovsky, lahat ng yan nagpapakita siya ng extreme emotionalism ng mga tao during that time. And another one is the different historical events that happened during that time. So romantics often create art based on the contemporary events, especially those related in politics, like for example, si Ludwig van Beethoven in his Third Symphony, which is a tribute to Napoleon Bonaparte. And then another one is nationalism. So, di ba dun sa video, diniskis dun, the reason Beethoven was so upset about Napoleon's self-coronation was because he believed that Napoleon was a champion of the common man. At eventually, nakita ng mga tao na hindi pala siya isang hero, kundi isang tyrant. And that is why nabuhos yung kanyang nationalism at in-express niya yon through his music. And alam din natin na mayroong mga composers like si Frederick Chopin from Poland who wrote music that promoted nationalism by incorporating folk music sa kanyang mga compositions. And then we have yung si Eugene, di ba? Na si Delacroix, no, na nag-create ng painting about liberty leading the people. And another trend is what we call nature. The attempting to capture the power and beauty of nature was tempting challenge for artists and musicians alike. So we know that during the time of the Romantic period, kumbaga usong-uso ang landscape painting during that time. At isa yan sa mga talagang pinaperso ng mga painters and even mga musicians nung panahon na yun, naturalism. And then another is realms of fantasy, an exploration of all things fantastic, including the idyllic, irrational, world of dreams, and surreal. Those are encouraged during the time of the Romantic era. And lastly, we have exoticism. So what is the meaning of exoticism? With the imaginative realms of fantasy coming from a fascination with the exotic, yung mga composer, they try to convey itong mga exoticism na to, itong kanilang mga fantasy na kanila nakikita. So, may mga composers at may mga artists that they try to create music and arts based dun sa mga libro, dun sa mga novels, dun sa mga stories na naririnig nila na kung tutuusin hindi sila makatotohanan, at saka pinapakita yung exoticism dun sa mga artworks na yun. Now that we are done with our discussion, it's time for our activity. So what are you going to do today is a written activity wherein you will write a short essay, minimum of 30 words, about the connections between romantic music and art. So kaya ako pinag-take down notes kasi dito nyo i-base yung mga ideas ninyo or yung mga takeaways ninyo sa ating discussion. So simple lang naman, what are the connections that you have note down based from our video presentation between romantic music and art? So cite some examples based on the video presented, and then turn in your assignment on Google Classroom post today. So, kung kayo ay nakapanood ng video presentation na to, malalaman ninyo on how to do that because hindi ko ipopost yung details nung kung paano nyo gagawin itong essay ninyo dun sa Google Classroom para talagang makikinig kayo ng discussion natin. So again, what you are going to do is to write a short essay composed of a minimum of 30 words about what are the connections between romantic music and art, and then cite some examples like what are the different paintings that were discussed in the video, who are the composers or the artists who were presented in the video presentation. So ganun lang, ipapaliwanag yun lang ano yung connection ng romantic music dun sa kanyang art, and then after you've done your essay, and you just turn it in dun sa post ko sa Google Classroom. Okay. By the way, if you have any questions regarding this activity, just feel free to give me a personal message. Naka-online naman ako sa time natin so that I could address and answer all your inquiries. So, thank you very much for attending our class. I hope that you learned something from me. Next week, we are going to have a synchronous class in music wherein we will summarize everything that we have learned from day 1 up to today, okay? So, lahat ng mga, kung gusto nyo na talagang ma-recap, lahat ng mga tinag-usapan natin, I encourage you to attend our Google Meet next meeting. And again, if you have any questions regarding our topic, don't hesitate to give me a personal message. And we'll try to answer all your questions next week, okay? So, again, thank you very much for attending our class. Stay safe and see you again next time. Goodbye!